Yeah, welcome to the last Ember Europe of the year. Chris and Ed are going to do an AMA, sort of where like all of you can ask questions about sort of state of things, what the next steps are, and so on.
Yeah, I'm happy to roll right in.
I stand ready too.
Chris, you showed us that in order to have your third demo working, you had to disable the hot modules reloading stuff. Is this something that we'll have to stick with, or we'll have hot modules reloading enabled at the end of the Vite, Embroider Vite work?
So Ed will probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that you can't necessarily get hot module reloading for free. It's not something that if we just turn it on, we expect everything to work exactly as you imagine. Instead, we actually have to do work as a framework to handle cases where we want to replace one module with another. And in case of Vite, you get information about the tree of modules that you needed to load to get to the one that needs to change, and we probably need to do something to reload those actively, essentially. It's not a situation where we are trying to release without it. Obviously, it's one of the big sellers. We want it to be instantaneous rebuilds. Even if we do release without it, rebuilds are going to be way faster than what we have right now. But it's either something that we implement before we release the stable version, the next major, this stuff that we're collecting, these PRs that are breaking changes, or we release the next major and then we add it as an enhancement. I hope that answers your question.
I could add to the answer too. I don't actually think it's even hard. We literally haven't tried. A module like Glimmer Validator that's trying to manage global state fundamentally shouldn't evaluate twice. Or if you want to make it evaluate twice, you've got to do work in Glimmer Validator, right? So it's the HMR is actually doing exactly, it's working. It's doing what HMR is supposed to do. It's running the code a second time. Glimmer Validator is designed to crash if it tries to run a second time. So it's just resisting HMR. Changing Glimmer Validator to not do that is a pretty small change, right? All the HMR offers an API to a module. If you want to be a module that says how to accept changes, you can just implement a hook, and then we would tell the Glimmer Validator would say, I can't be hot module reloaded. And that would actually mean is, had you happened to edit that Glimmer Validator file, it would cause a full rebuild instead of a hot module reload. Right. So it's purely a question of setting it up. That's what Chris means by saying it's just not free. HMR is working just great. It's just that lots of JavaScript code does not expect to run twice. It's a violation of the ES module spec, actually, to run a module twice. So HMR is kind of a hack. It's also really not a super high priority. Well, I'm not going to say I don't care about implementing the feature. I don't think it's very high priority in Vite because the full rebuild is instantaneous. It's supposed to be instantaneous, right? So it's nice for the case where you've written an app that has complex temporary state that doesn't get synchronized properly into the URL, so that when you're if you're working on a page and each refresh means you've got to click 3 times to get back to the component you're actually trying to look at, that's annoying, and HMR is good for that case. But that's the main thing. As a speed benefit, I don't think you'll even need it under Vite. But it's fine to use it, and we'll have it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, who's moderating questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what other questions do we have?
I guess we should be explicit. I assume we're talking about AMA questions now, not just things about the demo.
Yes.
So if anybody wants to ask any question of either myself or Ed or both.
What does that even mean, Kristen? Are you being sarcastic? Are you being ironic? Because
I mean, I know the answer, but I figured other people might be wondering, since people are thinking about how to get their apps smaller.
So people mean 2 different things by this, and one of them we have had for years already. Do you mean ripping modules apart?
Yeah.
I don't even think that's a feature Vite has. It's not a good idea. It's not necessary. I mean, the prod build can do the roll-up one. That's fine. And yes, that already works when you do it with Vite. I should try to clarify the two things people tend to mean by tree shaking is like files that you didn't need don't get included, or actual functions in those files that you didn't need get included, even when some other functions were used. And the first one is just that's like one of the first things Embroider did for Ember apps. That's why a bunch of apps have already been on Embroider for a long time. If that was their priority, was getting their apps smaller. It's already been really good at that. That we just have. The second one is like if you have a giant file with, say, 70 functions in it and you only import 2 of them, you can annotate those kind of libraries and tell bundlers like Rollup or Webpack that you want to consider them side effect free, essentially, and promise that it doesn't matter if they eliminate that code. That doesn't currently work because we rely so like in the Webpack based Embroider, it doesn't work because we rely so heavily on CJS interoperability, which doesn't have the full visibility into all the modules. But that's specific to the Webpack one. And like under Rollup, which is the prod build for Vite, it would necessarily already work.
There's 2 more questions I see in the chat. Ed, do you want to take the rewritten app?
Sure.
The strategy one?
Then yeah, the rewritten app is very close to getting killed and not needed anymore, which we're all looking forward to. That's part of why we see the upcoming next Embroider release with all these features as breaking, because we really do want to stop hiding away the tool you're actually using, whether that was Webpack or Vite or whatever. We think that should be the tool you run. Like, so if your app's being built by Vite, you should be running Vite, and the details of the other stuff can all be plugins, right? Instead of like if you use the currently released Embroider Webpack based stuff, you run Ember CLI, you have a Broccoli based pipeline, it calls Webpack as a library to do parts of the build, right? As opposed to running Webpack CLI and letting Webpack have a plugin that when it encounters an Ember specific thing calls out to Embroider to do the Ember specific thing. So that inversion goes along with not needing to rewrite. And we're steadily factoring features out of the rewritten app. So at the moment, the rewritten app is there specifically because there's a bunch of steps in Embroider that currently do things like write entry point files, synthesize a Babel config, synthesize a Webpack or Vite config, and rewrite your index.html to something different before we can handle that stuff off to Webpack or Vite. The idea is to like author it that way in the first place. So like I expect that in our next major, you're going to actually have to have an index.html that is like the one Vite expects, meaning like script tags in there, they point at the code you authored, not the bundles that you expect to be outputted by the build, things like that. Just the only thing, the remaining stuff that blocks that is really, we did one of the big pieces of it already, which was we no longer have to replace the whole node modules graph with a rewritten one. We've taken care of that in our resolver layer. Now we're porting the remaining features out of the rewritten app, and this goes kind of hand in hand with some RFC work going on upstream in Ember itself. We basically want to get very clear and explicit about where modules are coming from in an app, whether that's classic or Embroider. And so like I want to see your actual app.js have an import that gets you all of the classical things and like adds them to your resolver. And like now we didn't have to synthesize some entry point because your code actually invoked the right thing. Embroider's plugins can help with make that import have a meaning, right? And we'll just have much more explicit things. So yes, that's a long-winded way to say yes, the rewritten app is something we're trying to get rid of really fast. It also helps with several of the things that are currently hard to do in the demo Chris showed, in terms of getting reliably detecting our dependencies and being careful never to accidentally step off the edge of your app into a dependency without realizing that it did so. That's like a thing that tends to happen when the app itself has been rewritten into a weird location and you've confused Vite's assumptions. So
I'd love to add a little bit to that and kind of use that as a bridge to balance question as well. So obviously the demo today was all about Vite. We're talking about removing this rewritten app folder so that what you're looking at in your editor is exactly the thing that Vite is looking at. But the decision that we made to make the main branch of Embroider not releasable includes essentially enforcing inversion of control for Webpack as well. So we're going to have the same structure for a Vite app and a Webpack app, where at the end of this, you'll have a Webpack config in your folder that's pointing at an index HTML that points at your app.js. So it has the same thing. It does the same stuff, but it's just going through Webpack. And essentially that is I won't say blocker, but this is the sort of experience that we want to be available to people before we make it the default, before we even start thinking about making it the default. And that's the second half of the initiative. When I showed the kind of the headline on the Main Matter Embroider Initiative website, it's get the work done and then make it the default for everybody. And we want that default to be a sensible default. So we're not going to do that before the next major of Embroider. The next major of Embroider will require an inversion of control. So you'll need a Vite config, you'll need a Webpack config, whatever tool you end up using. And hopefully that won't be too long. We're not talking about years at this stage. We're talking about months. From my perspective, I see there being two phases happening soon. I'm not going to put a timeline on it because, first of all, it's very hard to put timelines on these things because it's very experimental. And second of all, every time we try and do something, there's 5 more bugs that we had to fix. So I don't know how many times that's going to happen. But once we get it all working as we expect it to in Vite, then we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to start completing work for the RFCs that we've already collected. We've got a list of RFCs that we know we need to do, like the V2 app spec RFC. Ed has, I feel like 20 at the moment. The deprecating AMD resolver. There's a few other ones that are kind of in progress at the moment. But that's the next 2 phases as I see it in terms of the initiative.
Yeah, some of that's happening concurrently too. So like I've landed some PRs into Ember source itself very recently, which might look kind of esoteric. They don't have a feature or anything in them, but they have already dropped all hard-coded need for the AMD loader in Ember source itself now. And that's actually kind of a big deal. It starts to pave our path to have a completely AMD-free build, which would be very, very nice. It makes so much stuff easier. Like Embroider's doing a lot of work to try to keep the stuff that's dependent on that working, even in Vite, and it does work. It's just that's where we're spending so much effort, right? And so this effort has always been about building from both directions and meeting in the middle. It's like building a bunch of compatibility stuff so that people can get going right away and not be blocked on waiting for their very last add-on to fix itself. But at the same time, deprecating old patterns, offering new alternatives, and getting the ecosystem to steadily move forward too, to fix the most painful things. And so the next stage of that is to have an optional feature in Ember itself that says everything's ES modules, and then have good messaging around that, and how people can adopt it, and how people can report bugs when they find things that don't work with it and things like that. So those kind of changes we're already upstreaming into Ember source itself as well.
I just want to add to that. I think sort of part of the initiative's goals is also sort of shifting the ecosystem, right, and making Embroider mainstream. And I think a part of that is also sort of giving teams that use Ember sort of a path to adopting Embroider, like even once it's stable, right? Which I think will probably mean migrating some of the most used add-ons, right? Because if Embroider is ready, like V2 specs are done, Embroider's sort of the default and so on, but all of the other or a lot of the add-ons that are sort of frequently used across the ecosystem don't actually work with it, then I think it's still a blocker for many teams, right? So I think, and that's going to depend on budget again, right? But I think if we have the time and capacity and resources and budget, I think like part of the initiative's goal would also be to, like update add-ons or find other ways to do things that everybody needs, because I think that's going to be like a major piece sort of in actually making it mainstream, like in practice, and not like theoretically it could be mainstream, but everybody's blocked by having to replace 15 add-ons that are not yet V2.
Yeah, no, that's the whole point.
I,
That is 100% the point of what we're doing, right? Because if the requirement was to touch everything first, you don't need Embroider. You just say like, hey, everybody, rewrite all your stuff and then just use out of the box Vite or whatever, right? The point is to not do that and have a steady, smooth upgrade path to that. So you're absolutely right. The vast majority of add-ons are working, right? It's just that there's a lot of Embroider is putting in a lot of work to make sure they do, and things get, so the less you rely on that, the more stable and fast things get. So it's a question of hopefully gradually ramping down that cost and complexity. The pre-build that Chris started in his demo, I mean, firstly, as like just as a don't worry about it kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that a Vite plugin can absolutely do for you in the background. We've been doing it explicitly because it's easier when we're debugging everything to do it explicitly. Like that process existing, it's a thing that will exist so long as you have classic add-ons. Those classic add-ons are working. Like it's ingesting the vast majority of them. But you won't need that process at all when you can get rid of the last ones, right? Then your build is faster and you get a simpler life, and so it's still worth doing. But yes, it's all about that process of not having you be blocked on stuff beyond your control.
The benefit of that as well, though, is that if we do add it as a Vite plugin, we'll probably make sure that it outputs, we spent this much time on your build to convert V1 add-ons. Here's the list. If you want to open PRs, that's where to go. So it should be one of those things that become low-hanging fruit once you get onto Vite. And that's really what our focus needs to be to start off with. And to echo your sentiment, Marco, if we get enough backers for this initiative, then we can actually do that work as well. But the money runs out when the money runs out, and we have to do as much as we can before that.
Yeah. Also, I think another one of the goals that we haven't really talked about was sort of making Embroider more maintainable, and also specifically reducing the bus factor, right? And I think the fact that the Embroider AMA is not only Ed, but Ed and Chris partly already answers that question, right? But maybe you want to say something about that as well.
So I think Ed will probably give me a status report on how I'm doing in a minute, but I have to share a few anecdotes. So I have a number of meetings with the initiative and with Main Matter where I give an update of what I've been working on. So once a week to different groups of people, I say, oh, I did this thing, I did this thing. And the weeks when I get a chance to identify a bug, find where it needs to be fixed, fix it, merge it, all when Ed's away on Thanksgiving, or I think there was one a few weeks before that, I was actually able to go full cycle on understanding like deep things, deep in the Embroider core resolver. When Ed's not there, it should feel just the same if Ed is there, but it feels just a little bit better that I don't have the safety net under me. So
it's working. Yeah, definitely, and I think it also speaks to it speaks to the initiative working. Firstly, it also speaks to the value in steady support for this kind of initiative, because it took investment to get many hours of pairing, of course, before you bring new people up to speed on a complex code base, right? And so we've made that investment, and now we're reaping the rewards. We're trying to repeat that process with more people now, right, and bring more people in as well. And Chris is already helping me scale that, because he spends time pairing now with other people like Andre. who are also getting up to speed on the code base now and working within the initiative. So that's yeah, so it is working, and it's just, you know, if you think about how long it takes to build a great software engineering team within your organizations and bring new people in and get them really up to speed, obviously, you know, we tend to enjoy a bit of like onboarding new people into Ember apps if they've ever seen one before, or even if they haven't, is like not that hard because Ember is pretty good at that. That's one of its strengths. In a you know in a complicated code base that's not as mature and doesn't have the docs and is solving a hard problem, you know that it takes a while to bring new people in and get them up to speed, but then once you do, it's really great to have that team. So we're succeeding on that and just need to keep executing.
Yeah. Like I said, that's really been great to see, and yeah, please fund us more so we can continue.
Yeah.
So another question from Annegret was around the teaching and documentation part of Embroider. Like how much work will that be, or is it just gonna, you know, like upgrade to the next major of Ember and it's gonna be working out of the box?
It'll definitely be work. I think that the good news is our intent is to be able to reduce the overall scope of required documentation, and therefore let the remaining things that are in scope be high quality. So what I mean by that is, once you are doing things in a not very weird way, right? So once you're following the normal conventions that a Vite or a Webpack app follows, you can lean on a lot of documentation that exists in those, for those, you know, projects. And then we can focus on having high quality documentation for the part that's specific to us. Because what we're going to have is we're going to say, here's the Ember Vite plugin, here's its options, here's what you need to do, here's how it works inside, right? Here's how it's set up, here's how the default blueprint sets it up for you, and it's got good comments in how it's set up for you. Like, the hope is to reduce the overall scope, right? We won't need to document how to do every last thing, because a lot of the answers are going to be like, you can just go read the chapter on how Vite does that thing, right? So that's part of the long-term strategy of, you know, being on more widely used tools in the ecosystem, getting off of some our legacy things that are too unique to us when they don't need to be, focusing on the things that are unique because they're good, and not the things that are unique just because they're what we happened to get locked into years ago. So, so that's not to say there's no work. There's definitely work. It's probably going to be an ongoing conversation with the learning team. Once there's an RFC to make this default, I think a very big part of that RFC will be the how we teach this section, where we're going to have to lay out what we do to the specific documentation sites. Things like, you know, there's currently separate Ember CLI guides from the other guides, and that's mostly because of how they were originally written. You know, do we like rename that to the tooling guides and start to include different sections on, like, here's the documentation for our Vite plugin, you know, here's the documentation for things that are common, you know, like, for example, how templates are compiled. If you're learning about the low-level setup, you know, if you're just using the blueprints, you won't have to do this stuff, of course. You'll get a blueprint that's set up to build your Ember app. But if you want to know how it works and go into the docs to the next level, we do need that content. You know, how templates are compiled is probably, it's not something you'll have to write differently for Vite or Webpack or whatever. It's just, you will say like, hey, there's this Babel plugin we use, it has to be set up, right? Or if somebody goes and implements one in not Babel, we can add that there too. Right now it's Babel. It becomes a more, so it becomes a conversation about where do we refactor the big picture stuff. You know, things like the Ember tutorial, the Ember guides. For there, it's going to be the basic work of, you know, when we have a new version that's got new commands to run. I mean, honestly, we're already kind of refactoring in the right direction, because the commands all say like, there's already an open project to make sure that when the tutorial is teaching you stuff, instead of saying Ember S, you say npm start. And if you do that, A, we're less weird again, because you could just follow that convention from npm. And B, if we change that from Ember S to Vite dev, you won't have to change the tutorial, right? So little things like that, making sure that the out of the box experience would be good for a newbie it's just, there's definitely work to read through the guides, notice stuff that's out of date, and bring it up to speed. So it's definitely going to be work. But I think the time to scope that work out is when we decide to make it so official that all of the docs on our website should switch over, like the actual Ember.js.com stuff.
Do we have any other questions?
Andre had one about abandoning broccoli. Is there a consensus? Yeah, so there's a couple ways add-ons use broccoli. So an add-on that's using it to manipulate itself mostly ends up just working out if so long as we have the pre-build still, right? And if that add-on gets around to converting to V2, it wouldn't be able to do that anymore, and then it wouldn't need the pre-build. If an add-on is using broccoli to rewrite your app code, that's not going to be a thing. I don't actually think that's very widely used. I mean, it is only in the sense that like Ember CLI Babel does that, but it does it a very focused thing, which is pass your app through Babel, and we can of course do that under Vite or Webpack or whatever directly. Other things that are doing the most complicated broccoli using add-ons tend to be things like, SaaS integrations or that kind of stuff. And all of that is dramatically simpler once you don't have broccoli, because we don't have to write it all anymore. It's like if you want to use SaaS under Vite, you Google Vite SaaS and you find the 3-line instructions to turn it on or whatever, right? So I think the ones that are the add-ons that were the hardest to write and use the most broccoli probably don't even need to continue to exist in this world. The add-ons that were using a little bit of it to customize themselves actually do already continue working. And I will say that apps using broccoli to customize their own code is a thing that can be done. I don't think it's super heavily used, but I'm sure if we looked around, we'd find some of your apps do a little bit of that. You will want to refactor away from that. I expect one of the things that does actually work right now, because we have the rewritten app, we run all the broccoli stuff before we pass your app off to Webpack or Vite, but we don't want to keep doing that. Our plan is to factor that away. And so like that is not probably going to be there on the next Embroider major. So start refactoring away from that. If you are using broccoli to rewrite your app code, there's a lot of good alternatives already. Even if you're on Classic, if your goal was to like include code in the build sometimes and not other times, you could, for example, move it to its own npm package and use Ember auto import to like import it into your app conditionally. Like then it would actually tree shake out. There's a lot of things like that that you can do already that would be better than using custom broccoli to rewrite your app.
I'd love to add to that, just because you mentioned Ember auto import. We have been working a lot on Embroider stuff, but we've also been working on Embroider related stuff. So Ember auto import is a good example. And one of the first things that myself and Ed paired on was adding a feature to Ember auto import called allow app imports. So this is something that wasn't possible before. What you used to have to do if you wanted to use Webpack to deal with code that is quote unquote your app, you would have to put it into a package, something else that was imported into your app. But now you can just put a bit of config in your Ember CLI build and say that folder over there, or anything that is a PNG, is loaded with Webpack. And that becomes super useful because, for example, when we're talking about add-ons that do weird stuff with broccoli and they can't do that once they move to V2, Simon Imig has a Ember responsive images add-on that a lot of people use, and there was a blocker to actually upgrade that to a V2 because there was no way to influence how images in your app would actually get built with a V2 add-on. And the solution is that if you want to support classic apps using a V2 add-on, you give people instructions on how to add a Webpack config to the Ember CLI build that says, for all PNG images or whatever the case may be, it should use the loader that Simon writes for you to support, I think he's adding question mark and then the sizes that you want to actually import that image with, so that you can like import in your JavaScript an image with a particular size and then use that URL in the same way that people have been doing for, I feel, decades, but it's probably only been a few years in the Webpack community. That's how loaders work. It's kind of a standard approach.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I said split it into a package, I forgot we had already shipped that feature. So now you don't even have to. You could just, yeah, you could decide to make a directory in your app that is lazy loaded, and even in Classic today, and that would work using that Embroider feature. So, and all of this is in service of getting everybody together on Embroider, right? Because it means you can begin dropping features like broccoli rereading of your app that aren't going to work under Embroider, and you could switch to patterns that are going to work under Embroider without getting over, even if you're not ready to jump over the hump yet because something else you use that isn't ready. So yeah, that's pretty good.
I think we're kind of at the end anyway of kind of the schedule. So, and we have answered a bunch of questions already, and it's Gatic phone time actually. Yeah. So I would say thanks, Ed and Chris, and thanks, Rich, for your talk as well, and sort of the official part of Ember Europe is over. Thanks everybody for coming.
No, the talks are fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming and giving us a few hours of your evening.